Pauliau, žodį perduodu tau.
Paulius, the floor is yours.
O aš noriu pristatyti mūsų kolegę.
Now, I would like to introduce our colleague Miglė Marcinkevičiūtė from
Be to, kad Miglė
Vilnius University, and apart from the fact that Miglė is going to defend her thesis at our center, Miglė is responsible for art processes, and we will have a conference next year, and Miglė is responsible for the artistic program. So she is in charge of other things rather only academic things. The presentation that she will make today is related to her in-depth study. This is a qualitative thesis study that sought to understand the phenomenon of pre-suicidal distress, how the difficulties experienced in life led to suicidal attempts or suicides, and why certain life events have more or less affected people's lives. And Miglė will tell you about it all herself. Thank you, Paulius, for the introduction. You have said everything very correctly. I will share my slides now, and as Paulius has mentioned, this is my thesis research study. It's about the pre-suicidal suffering phenomenon. The manager of my thesis is Danutė Gailienė, and I will now share with you what I have completed and how useful it may be to you. Briefly, what I will be speaking about, and first of all about the preparation to this study, what I knew in advance and what was the study sample that I compiled, about the methods, about the results, and I have also created the scheme illustrating the results. I will also show the scheme and, of course, the practical recommendations and conclusions. First, I would like to speak about the terminology. If you think that the suicidal process is a long stream of events happening in parallel to other events which help adapt to the suicidal crisis.
Okay, tai truputėlį grįžtame į ankstesnės, į tą pačią skaidrę, žodžiu, apie kurią kalbėjau, atsiprašau, žodžiu, pamiršau pasidalinti skaidrę.
Sorry for forgetting to share the slide. So if the suicidal process is longer going throughout the individual's life, my work is mostly related to the pre-suicidal suffering. We can understand it literally. This is related to what is happening before suicidality, suicidal ideation, and this is what I actually am investigating at this stage, what people experience at this stage and how the suffering experience starts developing. What I knew before organizing this, before starting this study. First of all, in many theoretical models, whichever you take, everybody agrees that life difficulties have to happen in a certain sequence. And I was raising the question in my thesis, what the sequence should be to give the basis for suicidality of a person, or suicidal ideation. And at this suicidal stage, there is a cumulative effect when some difficulties encourage others, and often they accumulate into one sequence. And this was the question of my study, how these events encourage each other. Then we have another typical element of pre-suicidal ideation is characteristic experience of unbearable psychological pain and prolonged suffering. And my work was to follow how, in people's experience, this suffering is developed, which becomes a point of departure for the appearance of suicidality. Some events that happen to a person may be experienced as insurmountable. And I was trying to observe in the suicidal phases which events seem to be insurmountable. There are internal actors that divert cognitions, and the question is why this intensifies the feelings. And it was important for me to observe when a person is experiencing a pre-suicidal suffering, what was the encounter of unsolvable situations and what specific meanings does it have. So the objective of my thesis was to analyze the phenomenon of pre-suicidal suffering based on the experience of people who have attempted suicide. And the questions raised in my research was, how is pre-suicidal suffering experienced? How does the basis for suicidality develop? And what do people lack most when faced with pre-suicidal suffering and suicidality? I try to answer those questions, and I will share with you how I did. Now, the preparation for the study was the following. I needed to carry out a quality analysis, and I applied in my research the information phenomenological analysis, and I asked questions based on what was known. First of all, I involved the people who had suicidal attempts involved in my research, and I asked them what had happened, and they told me about their last attempt and what difficulties they encountered before the attempt, and how they managed to deal with that, and what difficulties the surrounding people encounters, and what they were mostly missing. So I was asking them to share their experience so that they helped me understand the pre-suicidal state. Then there was informed consent, that the demographic data form filled out. Then I submitted to the Ethics Commission the request for authorization to carry out the psychological research, and I got it. And I conducted my research at Vilnius City Mental Health Center, and 3 units joined me in this research. I'm very thankful to those units for letting me see those people. And I had to fill out the protocol on how we can invite people and patients to participate in this study, what questions may be raised, and that was related to data protection and so on. The study was offered to patients, and if they agreed, I would go to the Vilnius City Mental Health Center and would carry out the research. and I didn't need any names or contacts. I just needed to communicate. What was the sample of my study? The clinical study involved 12 participants, and that was the clinical sample, and then the scope was those people who had suicidal attempts within the time scope of no more than 1 year. And then I asked not to involve people who were simply in a crisis situation. And I have 12 stories. To analyze them, I applied the interpretative phenomenological analysis. Its best element is the fact that it allows to compile individual experience models for every individual person, and to compile the group experimental model. So if we take a study on the glass of water, one would have the experience of different people who have the experience of different water glasses, the shapes of water glasses, and I wanted to analyze what the features of those water glasses, shapes of water glasses are. And that I called the pre-suicidal suffering. The result that I generated was based on those, as I've said, 12 stories about pre-suicidal suffering. And this generated 1,284 experiential statements, and I got 186 experiential topics, and I have 18 groups of experiential topics, and I will help you understand what they are. They are 18. We have 18 of these groups of groups of experiential topics. I will call them GET, and they illustrate the pre-suicidal suffering experience and the basis for the suicidality development. And the first 4 mostly reflect the needs of pre-suicidal suffering, the needs when experiencing the pre-suicidal suffering and suicidality. So I will first concentrate on the first 14. The first topic, or the first GET topic, that is, first of all, a line of events contributes to the willingness to attempt suicide. As we have said, this only confirms the fact that this is not a single event. This is a group of events, a series of events. For instance, somebody says, well, I think that everything got mixed, like in a salad, and that's good. This was said by Aiden. And I tried to follow up what is that everything, because in life everything cannot fall into one place, but sudden series of events falling into one place gave an impression of everything to that individual. Another experiential theme by the group, another GT, is some life difficulties which are difficult to overcome during the suicidal process, which were not experienced as related to suicide. People relate part of those difficulties to the emerging suicidality. And speaking about other difficulties, they don't relate them to suicidality. For instance, one said that when you have lots of children, of course you experience financial problems, but this is not related to her will to die. For instance, Laimonas, he was diagnosed with an oncological disease and he was fired. And he says that he was able to cope with that oncological disease and he accepted what was happening. And he did not relate this disease to his suicidality. But the experience of firing, being dismissed from work, was the central event which encouraged the development, the emergence of suicidality. So that means that the people who participated in the research, the respondents, said that some events are and some are not related to suicidality. Then repeated traumatic events create feelings of profound deprivation. I asked people through my first question to tell me what actually happened, and I allowed them to draw the historic line, chronological line of events, and they told me about the relationship with the parents or guardians and the traumatic elements in their lives. What showed to me this GET was the fact that the stage of pre-suicidal suffering starts with the repeated traumatic events that leave the feelings of huge deprivation inside the person. That is like a gap, a shortage of something that they cannot fill. And Aušra Kurienė did a huge job saying that when children having huge the feelings of deprivation are left on their own, they are later left with huge gaps, which are very difficult to fill later on. The next GET showed that people at the suicidal, pre-suicidal suffering level, having experienced that deprivation, develop the mechanism to suffocate those feelings. And we can remember the research by another scientist, another researcher, saying that people develop those compensatory mechanisms that sometimes give the direction in life. For instance, due to very difficult and traumatic relationships with their parents. Leah, the woman being quoted here, says that sometimes that feeling of inferiority arises. And she spoke about friends. She said, I have good friends. Well, I do have them. And my friends come to me and are very supportive. Even though I don't have such a stable family life, I have such good friends that sometimes I just don't really need a family, I think. So that means that people create another direction in their life so that they don't need the family that causes pain, which means that people direct their efforts and time to keep the relationship with their friends. Another GT says that the environmental events happening around, events happening in your environment actually provoke huge feeling of deprivation. And Robertas said that if something doesn't happen, that provokes certain feelings and reminds of the feelings that hurt and provokes such a condition. But while sometimes things just don't happen, and they say that one or another event would remind them of the painful events that accompany them all their lives. Another respondent said that this is very typical to suffer psychological pain for some time before suicidal tendencies emerge. And she says, and that Brigitte says, and that pressure was constant. And after a while, I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and I would swallow it, cry, take a quarter of the said medicine, come down and smile again. Another GT, which was very interesting and showed that before the suicidality emerges, it is very common to experience relief followed by disappointment again. For instance, Ona, she felt very neglected and didn't have a close relationship with parents, but she found a nice family which loved her. And she says, I saw once again what a beautiful family they are. They have a very beautiful relationship. They started taking care of me like their own daughter, and they really liked me. Everything was wonderful, but then problems started appearing with that guy, and I noticed that he was often quite aggressive and gradually began to criticize me and rebuke me. And another GT showed that there was a desire to resolve existing difficulties. Often we could see that people who appear in crisis, we think very often that they don't have the data on how to cope with that. In my case, the respondents put a lot of effort into trying to solve the difficulties, but it didn't work, and that's why suicidality emerged at a later stage. Of course, in order to retain the compensatory mechanism and protect people from very unpleasant accompanying experiences that allow to suffocate the traumatic and repeated events, people say that there's lots of exhaustion that they experience. This is like two types of exhaustion, emotional and physical. And after a physical exhaustion, you recover, while with emotional, it's different because you have to smile to everybody you meet, and then it results in physical exhaustion as well. And they were telling that before suicidality emerges, they had experienced that exhaustion. And another important GET was encountering the main trigger event. For instance, if we know that there is a compensatory mechanism and people are trying to maintain it at any time, they will encounter the realistic event in real life at one or another point in time, which will not allow the thought or worldview thrive. For instance, if somebody had a wide circle of friends and thought that friends don't betray, the main triggering event was the betrayal by the friend. And it was the same situation. She was betrayed by both the loved man and a very loved best friend. But the betrayal, but the suicidality was triggered not by being cheated by her boyfriend, but by the betrayal of the friend. Robert said that he would regain control over life if he found a girlfriend, and he actually got sick with COVID, and this disease triggered his suicidal thoughts. He says, actually, I had even planned, I should have started working on that in December, and it looked like it was the last time when I could attempt suicide. So his belief in being able to control himself, to regain control, was ruined.
After experiencing the main triggering event, an affective state followed, during which feelings of great deprivation from the past accumulated. Also, the present events. For example, Ona says, there were many such nuances. I started thinking about how my father left, how my mother didn't need me, how she forgot me, how my grandparents are gone, and everything from the past came back with them all together. It's a very strong emotional state at a time. And sometimes a dissociational state can come to be in order to protect oneself from what he's going through. And in that affective state, suicidal thoughts are experienced as arising automatically. Not the very start of the affective state marks the start of suicidal thoughts, but during the affective state, at some stage, the suicidal thoughts come up automatically. For example, Leah says, I grew up with my mother's relatives, my sister with my father's, and they kept telling me that I would either end up like my mother or kill myself like my father. It's like something integrated, to be a failure who constantly tries to heal herself. And everybody emphasizes that I have children, so I can't kill myself. But no one understands that it's not really up to me. So these thoughts are like arising automatically in the affective state, and they are very difficult to cope with. And at this stage, the suicide is perceived as a means of ending the suffering or minimizing the suffering. We can only try to imagine that when you are going through the biggest suffering of your life, you feel a very strong pain, and it's really difficult to get rid of the suicidal thoughts. These are the main 14 topics. I have put them in a diagram illustrating the results. So, to sum up, we have the experiential experience. It comes to a compensation mechanism, and the physical and emotional burnout. We have also the main triggering event that confronts the compensational mechanism, and we have the fall of the protecting compensational mechanism, and the person loses the perspective in their life. How can I keep going with what is happening to me? And here we have the intense affective state, where all the feelings and emotions that have been, that the person has tried to neglect come up, and the person comes to the suicidal crisis. Here, dissociation, or the suicidal thoughts, or the proximity can help, or some other means to cope with this state of mind. So if we come back to our 18 topics, we have discussed 14 of them, and I would like to discuss the remaining 4. What the person needs in a pre-suicidal suffering. I will not go so deep into them, but I would like to mention that if I ask the participants what would they have needed in order not to have these suicidal thoughts, they mention getting to know oneself, getting to know the coping strategies in order to avoid the affective states. Other aspect mentioned by the participants is the closeness of another person experience as a means of helping to calm down in an affective state. They used to tell me that when the triggering event happens and very painful experiences come up, a simple hug helps a lot. Or spending some time or talking to a close person is very important. But it cannot be a formal hug or a formal talk. It must be an experience. The participants also shared that when they are going through an affective state, they honestly only wants to be dead. And we as a specialist sometimes can face a person who only wants to be dead, doesn't want anything else. But the same person later at different stages also mentioned other ways of helping them. For example, the professional help as assistance when the person is no longer able to help him or herself. That the specialists are the ones who can help in this affective state to calm down. If we come back to my model that I have briefly discussed, so getting to know oneself would cover a big part of this model in order to avoid affective states, helping to go through the affective states in a safer way, in order to have this compensational mechanism that is not provoked in so frequently. And the closeness of another person when the affective state is getting more intense, the closeness of another person can help. For example, a talk, a conversation, a hug. Sometimes when you are in an affective state and nothing helps, and you have tried other coping strategies, it can be this case that the person only wants to be dead, or the professional help is seen as a helpful assistance. When you see that you cannot help yourself, you don't know how to cope with the situation, you can approach professionals for professional help. Conclusions: how the pre-suicidal suffering is experienced. So that's the model that I have come to. How the basis for the suicidal behavior is created. The intense affective states of mind are very important. During these states of mind, the suicidal thoughts come up, and what people need in this situation. So what I mentioned, getting to know oneself, the closeness of another person, or a professional help or assistance. And here we come to practical recommendations.
Apskritai, iš viso tyrimo, kurį
In general,
ar ne to modelio, ką aš
um,
pagalvojau, kad būtų galima išsinešti.
what are the takeaways from my model and my study?
Manau, kad rastas modelis tikrai gali padėti.
The model found in this study may be valuable to professionals in better understanding people experiencing pre-suicidal suffering and or emerging suicidality. The model can help to understand which stage of the experience a person is currently in. When working with people experiencing pre-suicidal suffering or suicidality, it is valuable to talk about affective states and their basic principles of operation. For me as a specialist, it's very important to explain how the affective states function and what are the basic principles of operation. It is valuable to follow the main triggering events for a specialist. It can become a guide that helps to reveal the experience of suicidal suffering. I have included this recommendation because the participants of my study presented very different experiences. Some of them spoke in a very direct way, others didn't. So the main triggering event is one of the closest event to suicidality. And it's usually easier to speak about this experience for the participant. Other experiences are not so easy to reflect on. When I work with my patients, I see that it is very useful to come to this triggering event. If I ask, what did it ruin? What your vision of life or world did this triggering event ruin? So this is my recommendation to follow the triggering event. It is also valuable to increase people's self-awareness, feelings of great deficiency, compensatory mechanisms, triggering events and affective states, and what individualized measures could help them to endure or reduce their intensity. It's very important to individualize because the experiences are very subjective. The compensatory mechanisms are also very different for each person, and the affective states and the triggering events also. The measures how to go through this affective state, they should be individual. It is also important to inform the patient that during the affective state, he or she can get suicidal thoughts, but it's not necessary to act on them. And when the affective state comes to an end, the suicidal thoughts are likely to come to an end. It is also very important to speak about safe survival of affective states in the long-term therapeutical work, and speak deeper about suicidality. What does suicidality and suicidal thoughts mean to that particular person, and what would be the alternative means to come to the same objective? For example, how to reduce the suffering, what would be the measures to reduce the suffering or to increase the perceived peace. So that would be all from me today. Thank you a lot for your attention. Thank you, Miglė, for the presentation. We have lots of gratitude for you and a couple of questions and not too much time. I will read a couple of questions. If you can answer, please shortly, briefly, in order to go with a couple of them.
Tai čia yra, viena dalis, kad
this
tai yra tokiom ūmiom suicidinėm
model
krizėm.
applied to borderline personalities.
Nes ribinės asmenybės sutrikimo.
Yes, it might apply. Borderline personalities experience lots of triggering events, and this model can apply. In your recommendations, you spoke that it is important to speak about affective states and their basic principles of operation. What would you tell? People do not know that affective states exist in their lives. So we should present the concept itself that sometimes when we feel like we are not in control of our behavior, this is an affective state, and we actually do not have control of our actions. What could we do? We should observe, not act on this. First of all, come through this state of mind and look for ways of coping with it. If we have difficulties in the present because of the violence, bullying, and neglecting in the childhood, and your parent does not understand the situation, is it worth investing in the relationship with this parent? Can it help in the present? Well, it's a very multifunctional question. It might be yes, it might be no. It depends on the triggering events. We could come back to the presentation of Aušra Kurienė, that our parents also have their background, their experiences, why they act the way they act. First of all, I should think about my safety. Am I safe enough to cope with the possible triggering events or affective states? Is it worth reviving the relationship? It's not for me to decide. What would you recommend as instruments? Mindfulness, diary, affirmations, anything. It might be ceramics, writing, climbing walls, anything at all. Because coming to know better oneself or getting to know oneself better, it's important to get to know the pain, the suffering. If we feel like we are trying to fill in some kind of gap, that we don't know how this gap came to be, to know where we invest all the energy in our life. Is it necessary to do this? Do we need this? And get to know our triggers. What are the triggering events where we start to behave in a different way, that we would not like to behave like this? For an existentialist like me, I think that it is so important to remember that to know myself, it is very important to know the person who is close to me, not only the instruments. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for your answers. And now we have a short break until 11:15, where we will proceed with the following presentation.